killer's son panics as police uncover the murder videos. Hook. What happens when you can't escape the darkest corners of your mind? This gripping tale will leave you questioning everything, as a man is forced to face the one thing he's been running from his entire life, himself. Will he ever find peace, or is he doomed to live with his past forever? Stay with me until the end, because you won't believe how it all comes together. The phone buzzed on the table. It was a sharp, vibrating hum. He stared at it, frozen. His heartbeat quickened. The message was brief. Too brief. Your videos, we found them. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He quickly snatched the phone, eyes wide, hands trembling. The message was from an unknown number. His gut twisted. His throat tightened. The weight of his actions pressed on him. The room felt smaller. The walls were closing in. He could hear his breath, ragged and shallow. He glanced at the corner of the room. The old clock on the wall ticked slowly. Each second felt like an eternity. It was too quiet. Too still. He reached for the laptop. His fingers fumbled across the keyboard. He needed to delete everything. Every single video. Every trace. His mind raced. His palms were slick with sweat. But his thoughts were scattered, confused. A faint siren sounded in the distance. He froze, staring at the screen. A new message appeared. It's too late. His eyes widened. His stomach twisted. The siren grew louder. His pulse pounded in his ears. His breath came in shallow gasps. He slammed the laptop shut, his fingers numb. The room felt suffocating now. The door outside creaked open. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. They were getting closer. The siren was almost deafening now. A knock came at the door. Sharp. Urgent. His heart pounded in his chest. He stumbled backward, his legs weak. The sound of the knock seemed to reverberate through the walls. He looked toward the window, then back at the door. He didn't know what to do. His body felt heavy. Like lead. Another knock. Louder this time. Police! A voice shouted from the other side. His breath caught in his throat. The room spun around him. He felt the cold sweat on his skin. His mind raced with thoughts of escape. But there was nowhere to run. No place to hide. The officers would know. They'd seen the videos. They had everything. A chill ran through his bones. The door handle turned. Slowly. The sound of it was unbearable. Like a death sentence. He could hear their footsteps outside. The door creaked open. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. A shadow filled the doorway. A silhouette of authority. Two figures stepped inside. The officer's voice was cold. Don't move. His heart skipped a beat. The door swung wide open. The officer's footsteps were heavy on the floor. He stood still, paralyzed. The air felt thick, suffocating. His eyes darted from the officers to the window. No escape. His mouth went dry. The officers were inches away now. One of them spoke again. You think you're smart, don't you? He swallowed hard. The words hit him like a punch. They knew everything. The video. The murders. The evidence. The room felt colder. The walls felt tighter. His pulse roared in his ears. The officers didn't move. They just watched him. Staring. Waiting. The silence stretched on, suffocating. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. Nothing came out. The weight of the situation crushed him. Step away from the desk, one officer ordered. His legs trembled as he took a slow, uncertain step backward. Every movement felt like it echoed in the room. The other officer stepped forward. A sharp, metallic click of handcuffs. He could feel the cold steel around his wrists. His skin went numb. His head spun. The officer's voice was low. You're under arrest for multiple murders. The words hit him harder than any blow. He wanted to scream, but the words caught in his throat. The world felt distant, like he was watching it from far away. His breath was quick and shallow now. The officers didn't hesitate. They started to search. Every drawer. Every corner. He could hear the rustling, the thudding of the floorboards. Each sound made his stomach turn. Each step brought them closer to the truth. He tried to focus on the room. The cold walls. But his mind was a blur. The floor felt unsteady beneath his feet. The officers' faces were unreadable. They moved methodically, with no rush. There was no need for speed. They knew. They already had everything. A loud crash. A drawer was thrown open, papers spilling out. His stomach lurched. They would find the hard drive. The one with everything. Every frame. Every detail. He backed it up. Kept it hidden. But they would find it. They would find it all. And then, there would be no escaping. His throat tightened again. A moment of clarity struck him. This was it. The end. He couldn't run. The officers were already on him. One grabbed his arm. The other rifled through the papers. He closed his eyes for a moment. Maybe it was better this way. He was trapped. But as the officers moved closer, the fear intensified. And then, a thought. A sharp, sudden thought. A backup plan. A final escape. He had one last chance. Maybe. Just maybe. If he acted fast. The idea came in a flash. A desperate, reckless thought. His eyes flickered to the desk drawer. The small, black box hidden inside. The backup plan. It had to work. It was his last shot. His heart pounded as he shifted his weight. He could feel the officer's grip tightening on his arm. But his mind was already elsewhere. His fingers twitched, itching to reach for the drawer. One last move. The officer wasn't looking. For just a second, he was free. His hand slid into the drawer. His breath caught. The black box was there, tucked beneath some papers. His fingers closed around it. Cold. Hard. Heavy. The weight of it felt like a promise. The officer's voice broke through his thoughts. Stay still. The other officer was still rifling through the papers. They hadn't noticed yet. He slowly pulled the box from the drawer. His palms were slick with sweat. The box was small, unassuming. But it held everything. The secret. The escape. The final piece. His hand wrapped around the button on top. A soft click. The hum started faint, low at first. A whirring sound. Almost imperceptible. The officers didn't hear it. They were too focused on the mess around them. He slipped the box into his pocket. And waited. The humming grew louder, louder still. His heart raced. The device would take a minute. Just a minute. A minute he didn't have. He could feel the officer's eyes on him now. The cold pressure of the handcuffs. The other officer was moving toward the laptop. His breath caught in his throat. The sound of the whirring device filled his ears. Closer. Closer. The officer reached for the laptop. He moved fast, turning his back just enough. Now. He yanked the box from his pocket. Fingers trembling. The whirring hit a peak. The device pulsed with energy. A flash of light. A burst of static. The room went dark. A loud, crashing sound filled the air. The lights flickered. Then, nothing. Absolute silence. The officers froze, confused. The buzzing from the device stopped. Everything was quiet. It felt wrong. Like time had stopped. He couldn't hear the officers anymore. His breath was loud in his own ears. He dared not move. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a muffled voice. Where is he? The officer turned in confusion. The flash. The static. The blackout. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The seconds stretched out. He couldn't tell if they saw him or not. He was still. Breathing in the thick, heavy air. His heart was pounding in his chest. The officers moved closer. The tension was unbearable. And then, a voice from the doorway. Did you hear that? Another officer. A third one. They didn't know where he was. But they were getting closer. Closer still. The darkened room, the humming device. It was his chance. But would it be enough? It had to be. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. He could feel his pulse in his neck, his temples. Every breath felt too loud. Too obvious. His hand was still clutching the black box, hidden in his pocket. He could hear the officers shuffling around the room. Their voices were low, uncertain. "Where the hell did he go?" one officer murmured. "Search the room," another replied, their voice sharp with authority. His eyes darted around the darkened space. The only light now came from the faint glow of the emergency exit sign above the door. Everything was hazy in the dimness. He could hear the creaking of floorboards as they moved closer. Closer. Every inch felt like a mile. His body was frozen, a statue in the dark. The hum of the device had stopped. But something else, something more dangerous, was stirring in the silence. Footsteps. Heavy. Quick. They were coming closer. His mouth was dry. His throat tight. He couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. One officer passed by him. So close. So close. He held his breath. The officer's flashlight beam swept across the floor. It skimmed the edges of the desk. Then the shelves. The corner of the room. The beam flickered, then moved away. But it was enough. Just enough time. His hand moved before he could stop it. It wasn't even a thought. Just instinct. The door was his only way out. He shot toward it. His movements were swift but calculated. He heard the officers shout, but it was too late. He slammed into the door, his hand reaching for the handle. It didn't open. Locked. His breath caught in his throat. Panic surged. He couldn't let them catch him. Not now. He turned, eyes searching for anything that could help. A window. The back window. The one no one thought to check. His mind raced as he ran across the room. He reached the window in seconds. His hands fumbled with the latch. Outside, darkness. No street lights. Just shadows. But the moment the window was open, a loud voice called from behind. "Don't you dare move!" His heart dropped into his stomach. They knew. They were onto him. He didn't look back. The jump was too high, but he had no choice. He squeezed through the opening, feet first. The drop was sharp. Painful. But it was nothing compared to the cold hands that were about to grab him. He landed hard on the ground, gritting his teeth. Pain shot through his legs, but he didn't stop. He ran. Through the yard. Into the alley? His lungs burned with each breath. He could hear them shouting, their footsteps behind him now. But he had the lead. Just a few more blocks. A few more moments. He wouldn't look back. He couldn't afford to. His mind was blank now. Only instinct. The only thing that mattered was the escape. He turned a corner. Another. The streetlights flickered weakly above him. The night felt endless. The sound of sirens filled the air. Too many of them. The pursuit was tightening. But he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. Not yet. Not until the final escape. And that was when he saw it. The dark alley. The van. His van. Everything was in place. Just one more move. Just one more chance. He reached the van, hands shaking as he pulled open the door. But as he slid inside, a sharp pain shot through his chest. His heart stuttered. For a split second, everything went still. Then, everything went dark. The darkness was thick. Heavy. It swallowed him whole. His chest felt tight. He couldn't breathe. He gasped, but it was like the air had vanished. His vision blurred. The pain in his chest surged again, sharp and cold. His hand clutched at his shirt, at his heart. Nothing. He tried to move. Tried to shift. But his body felt numb. Frozen in place. The van's interior was a blur of shadows and dim lights. The world outside had disappeared. And then, he heard it. The sound of tires. squealing, racing toward him. His pulse thundered in his ears. His mind was trying to focus, to understand. But the pain kept pulling him under. His fingers twitched. He tried to lift his head. Just a little. The van's door. It opened. Footsteps. 2 sets of heavy boots. Is he? Yeah. He's out cold. His body went stiff. Voices. Familiar voices. He could barely hold on to consciousness, but he recognized them. The officers. They were here. They'd caught up. Had they? He didn't know how much time had passed. Seconds? Minutes? But the room felt cold again. The voices faded in and out. Check his pulse. Another voice, deeper. The hands that grabbed at his shirt. The fingers that pressed into his neck. They were cold. Too cold. He couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Nothing but the throbbing pain in his chest. A distant hum. The whir of sirens. And then, silence. The pressure on his neck vanished. He could hear the officers moving, murmuring. But it was all so far away. His eyelids felt heavy. Like weights. And just when he thought he might slip completely into the darkness. A whisper. Wake up. His eyes opened. But it wasn't the officers. No. It was someone else. A figure. Dark, shifting in the shadows. The face was barely visible. The voice low and calm. Did you really think they'd find you? His chest burned. His body was still sluggish with pain, but the voice. It was too familiar. His heart skipped a beat. He couldn't place it, but he knew the voice. Who are you? He gasped, his voice barely a whisper. But the figure just smiled. A slow, sinister grin. And in the dim light, he saw the flash of a familiar black box. The one he thought he had left behind. The one with the secret. No one has found you yet, the figure said softly. But they will. The words hung in the air. And then, the darkness took him again. This time, he didn't fight it. The darkness swallowed him whole. This time, there was no resistance. No panic. Just a deep, overwhelming pull into nothingness. His mind was a blank void. A cold, empty space. But the pain, the burning in his chest, it lingered. And the voice. It echoed in his head. We'll find you. The whispering words reverberated like a heartbeat, slow and steady. It was a promise. A threat. But where was he? The void began to shift. He could feel it. A faint light. Far, far away. A distant glow, like a tunnel. A tunnel he couldn't see, but he knew it was there. He tried to move toward it. But his body refused. His limbs felt like lead. And then, he heard it again. The voice. Clearer this time. A soft chuckle. Pathetic. He tried to open his eyes, but they were heavy. Closed. Shuttered tight. He could feel the air around him now. The stale, cold smell of metal. Of something wet, metallic, like blood. His chest tightened. His hands were cold. Freezing. Where was he? The light grew stronger. Closer. But with it, the shadows crept in, darker, stretching around him like fingers. And then, something sharp. A sudden sting in his leg. A needle. He gasped, but no sound came out. The pain in his chest flared again, a raw, burning fire. The shadows were getting closer. The light was shrinking. He had no strength left to fight it. Just when he thought he might lose all sense of himself, the darkness broke. A scream. His own voice. It shattered the silence. And then, he was back. Back in the van. But something was different. The air smelled wrong now. Like chemicals. Sterile. Cold. His body jerked. His eyes snapped open. The bright, blinding lights above him hurt his vision. He was lying down. On something hard. Metallic. A hospital bed? He tried to move. Tried to sit up. but his body wouldn't respond. It was like his muscles were made of stone. His vision blurred, then cleared. He saw them. Figures standing around him. Shadowy, indistinct. Not officers. Different. They weren't wearing uniforms. He tried to speak. His mouth was dry, cracked. A shadow leaned closer. A face. Half hidden in darkness. A cold grin. "You're awake," the figure said, voice thick with amusement. But there was something else behind it. A trace of something sinister. "Good," they continued. "We need you to understand." He tried to move again. His fingers twitched. "Understand what?" he whispered hoarsely. The figure's face was now clear. A man. Tall. Thin. With dark, sharp eyes. His lips curled into a smile. "You've been part of something much bigger than you realize." He couldn't speak. His breath was shallow. Ragged. The figure stepped back. A different figure, smaller, moved in next. "Don't worry. You're not dead yet," the new voice said. It was soft. Women's voice. But cold. Too cold. His chest burned again. His breath quickened. "You're just not alive either," she added, almost casually. The world spun again. He wanted to scream, but nothing came. Everything around him felt wrong. The room was small, claustrophobic. Metal walls. Hard surfaces. And the figures. They were closing in. The door behind them opened. Another figure stepped inside. A man, older, wearing a long coat. He moved toward the bed. His eyes were cold. Calculating. "We've been watching you," the older man said, voice steady. His eyes flicked down at the black box. His black box, that was now on the table beside the bed. The man smiled faintly. "It seems you weren't as clever as you thought." He leaned closer. "You thought you'd escape. But you're already part of something much bigger." A sharp panic rose in his chest. He tried to sit up again. Tried to scream, to fight back. But his body wouldn't obey. His throat tightened. His skin tingled. And then, just like that, the world went black again. This time, there was no voice. No whisper. Just darkness. Endless, suffocating darkness. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever. It was thick, oppressive, like being buried alive. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't listen. It was as if he was chained to the nothingness. No sound. No light. Just endless void. Then, a faint pressure in his chest. A slow, steady pulse. A heartbeat? It wasn't his. It was something else. He could feel the pulse growing stronger, more insistent. The air was cold again. Too cold. It was as if he was submerged in ice. And then, something stirred in the dark. A whisper. "Wake up." It was sharp. Not gentle. A command, not a request. His eyes snapped open. His body jolted with a shock of pain. The cold sensation from before hit him full force. He gasped, but the breath caught in his throat. He was in a room. A small, cramped space. The walls were gray, steel gray. So close he could touch them if he reached out. He was lying flat on his back. Metal under him. The lights above flickered with a dull hum. The sound of the hum was maddening, filling his ears. His heart raced. His chest burned. He tried to move, but his limbs were stiff. Heavy. Everything felt wrong. His mind was still groggy, confused. He couldn't think straight. The fog was thick. But he could feel it now. The cold steel table beneath him. The harsh, blinding light. The sterile air. And then, the footsteps. Slow. Methodical. Like someone walking with purpose. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog in his head. The footsteps grew closer. A figure emerged from the shadows, just a silhouette at first. The figure was tall, wearing a black coat. The coat seemed to swallow the light. But the face was too familiar. It was him. The man who had been watching him. The one who had spoken to him in the van. But this time, there was no smile. No amusement. Just cold, calculating eyes. His gaze locked onto him. "You're awake," the man said softly. His voice was calm, almost serene. The man took a step closer. His presence felt overwhelming. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" The words felt like ice water splashing on his face. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw. His mouth dry. What did you do to me?" he gasped. The man's smile was slow. Unsettling. "We did nothing to you," he replied. "But you've been part of this for a long time." His words settled into the air like heavy smoke. The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving his. "Do you remember?" he asked, his voice dripping with something cold. The questions flooded back into his mind. Memories. Fragments. The videos. The murders. The escape. The box. But what was this? Where was he? What was happening? He opened his mouth again, but the man silenced him with a raised hand. "You don't need to talk," the man said. "Not yet." The figure reached into his coat pocket. Slowly, with careful precision, he pulled out something small. Something familiar. It was the black box. The same one. The one he thought he'd lost. The one that had been his escape. But now, it felt different. The man placed it on the table beside him, just inches from his face. He could see it clearly now. The box was silent. Too silent. A small light blinked once, then went dark. The man stepped back. And for the first time, he spoke with something almost like pity. "Did you really think you could run?" He reached for something else, a small device in his hand, and with a smooth motion, he pressed it to the box. The soft click was almost imperceptible. And then, everything went black again. Not the comforting, empty darkness he'd known before. This time, it was sharp. Endless. Paralyzing. The room disappeared. The hum of the lights died. And all that was left was the sharp, cruel void. Time ceased to matter. There were no footsteps. No voices. No escape. Only the blackness, wrapping itself around him. The cold. The nothing. And then, the whisper came again. "Wake up." This time, there was no mistaking it. The voice wasn't from the man. Not from anyone he knew. It came from somewhere else. Somewhere deeper. "Wake up. You have no choice now." And with that, the blackness swallowed him whole. The blackness was absolute. A void that stretched beyond time. He couldn't tell how long it had been. Minutes? Hours? Days? The concept of time had dissolved. His mind was trapped. Pulled between moments that didn't exist. But then, a sudden pressure. It wasn't physical. It was like the weight of his own thoughts, pushing down on him. Crushing him. His chest tightened. He couldn't breathe. He gasped, a desperate, sharp intake of air. And then, a light. Faint. Flickering. It was like a match being struck in the dark. His head throbbed with each pulse of light. A figure moved through the light. Or was it the light that moved? It was hard to tell. A shadow. Thin. Tall. Unsettling. A figure that seemed to grow larger with every passing second. And then the voice. The voice that had whispered to him before. Now it was louder. Clearer. Closer. "Do you understand now?" He tried to speak. To scream. To fight it. But his body wouldn't obey. His limbs were stiff, frozen. And the figure, the shadow, moved closer. It was the man again. The one in the black coat. But his face was different now. It was older, gaunt, eyes sunken and dark. The light flickered again, revealing a room he didn't recognize. It was cold. Gray. There were machines everywhere. Humming, whirring, beeping. He was in a place. A place that felt wrong. That felt unnatural. The figure stepped closer, the floor creaking under his weight. "You're part of something bigger," the man said again, his voice almost tender now. The words felt like they were being etched into his mind. Do you understand yet? His chest burned again, as though the weight of the question was too much to bear. He wanted to shout, to beg. But there was no sound. Only the oppressive silence, broken by the hum of machines. The man leaned in closer, his breath cold on his face. Do you understand the cost of your actions? His words were thick with something darker now. A hint of menace. His eyes locked onto him. The intensity was suffocating. His heart skipped a beat. Suddenly it clicked. The pieces began to fall into place. The videos. The murders. The box. The escape. This wasn't just about him. He wasn't just a fugitive. He was part of something much larger. A project. An experiment. A plan. He was the subject. The realization hit like a wave. The figure straightened. His expression unreadable. Good, he said softly. The man turned, walking toward a table covered in cables and monitors. He glanced back, a twisted smile forming at the corner of his lips. You'll understand fully soon enough. He pressed a button on the table. Suddenly, the machines around him roared to life. Lights flashed, screens blinked on. A sharp, high-pitched beat filled the room, followed by a series of low, mechanical whirs. Something was happening. Something beyond his control. He tried to speak. To scream. But all that escaped his lips was a dry, desperate gasp. The room began to blur. The hum grew louder. His body trembled violently, as though being pulled in every direction. The lights above flickered, flashing violently. A wave of nausea surged through him. And then, the room started to spin. He felt it. The change. Something was taking over. Not just his body. His mind. He could feel it. Like tendrils wrapping around his thoughts, twisting, controlling. Do you understand now? The man asked again, his voice cold. The machines around him hissed. Lights flashed. The walls closed in. And for the first time since it all began, he understood. But it was too late. The last thing he saw was the man's cold, calculating eyes. And then, the darkness took him again. This time, it felt final. The darkness was unyielding. It wrapped around him, suffocating. Cold, impenetrable. For a moment, there was no sensation. No thought. Just the weight of nothingness pressing in from all sides. But then, it fractured. A single pinprick of light. A dull, flickering pulse in the blackness. It grew, expanding, swallowing the darkness whole. His eyes opened slowly, but the world felt wrong. Out of place. He was no longer in the room. No longer in the place of cold machines and sterile air. Now, he was standing in the middle of a vast, empty space. The ground beneath him was hard, cracked stone, stretching endlessly in all directions. A faint mist rolled across the floor. The air was thick with a strange hum. He looked around, but there were no walls, no ceiling. Just an infinite expanse. The silence was deafening. And yet, it felt like he wasn't alone. He could feel it. The weight of unseen eyes. A presence. Watching. He took a step forward. His body moved, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. Every muscle screamed in protest. His heart raced, but there was no escaping the pull of this place. He didn't know what it was, where it was, or why he was here. But he knew deep down that he was no longer in control. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift. The air, too. It was like he was standing in a place between worlds. The hum grew louder. A distorted sound. Like voices, but they were garbled. Unintelligible. Then, a figure appeared in the distance. A shadow moving in the mist. He froze. The figure moved closer, and as it did, the hum intensified. It was the same man. The one in the black coat. But his face was different. Distorted. Twisted. The man's eyes were empty sockets, black voids that seemed to pull everything into them. He spoke, but the words were a jumble of static. "You didn't think this would happen?" His voice was like a scream, but drowned in distortion. The figure's form flickered, disappearing and reappearing in different places around him. His skin crawled as the man's presence seemed to invade every corner of his mind. "You're part of this." The words broke through, garbled but clear. The ground beneath him trembled. He tried to move, but his body was paralyzed. His chest constricted, as if the air itself was thickening, pressing against him. The man's shape loomed closer. The eyes, those dark, empty voids, were now inches from his face. He could feel the cold breath against his skin, even though the air was freezing. The man's voice, sharp and piercing now. "You thought you were running, escaping." His skin felt like it was burning, tingling, as if every inch of him was being pulled apart. "You never were." The voice exploded, shattering the space around them. And then everything stopped. Complete silence. The figure vanished, leaving only the oppressive weight of the air pressing down on him. He was alone again. But the presence was still there. A suffocating weight hanging over him. He stumbled forward, his legs trembling. The mist parted just enough for him to see something in the distance. A door. A small wooden door. It was half open. A faint light flickered beyond it. Hope. His body moved toward it, almost against his will. Each step felt like an eternity. The air seemed to grow colder, the ground colder. Every instinct screamed at him to stop. To turn back. But he had no choice. The door was close now. Closer. He reached out. His fingers brushed the handle. The door creaked open. And what lay beyond was even worse than what he had imagined. A vast, endless hallway stretched out before him. Its walls were lined with mirrors. Endless reflections of himself. Distorted. Twisted. Each one was a different version of him, some grotesque, some blank. They moved. The reflections blinked. Some even smiled. A cold sweat broke out across his skin. The lights in the hallway flickered. He stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind him with a deafening thud. He turned back, but the door was gone. Vanished. The hallway stretched infinitely. The reflections grew more distorted. Each version of him seemed to be watching, waiting. Then, a voice echoed down the hallway. It wasn't the man. It wasn't anyone he recognized. But the words, the chilling words, froze him in place. "Welcome to the end." And just like that, the hallway began to close in. The walls shifted. Narrowed. The mirrors distorted, their reflections becoming more horrific with each passing second. He was trapped. And this time, there was no escape. Only endless, haunting reflections of himself. Staring back. Waiting. The final trap had closed. The walls were closing in. Slowly. Relentlessly. The mirrors stretched farther down the hallway, the reflections growing more grotesque with every inch. Each one was a twisted version of himself. The eyes in the mirrors were wide, unblinking, following his every move. Some of the reflections smiled. Others, they wept. The sound of their distorted breathing filled the air. A low, rasping wheeze. A sound that seemed to come from all directions. The hallway narrowed further, the walls pressing in. He could feel the weight of the space, pressing on his chest, squeezing out every ounce of air. His heart pounded in his ears, but it was no use. His legs felt like lead. He tried to move, but each step was harder than the last. It was like walking through tar. The further he went, the more distorted the reflections became. Some of them were deformed, their faces cracked and bleeding, their features melting into grotesque shapes. Others were covered in blood. Some just stared, vacant and hollow. But they all had one thing in common: they were watching him. Each one trapped in the same hellish cycle. He reached out to touch the wall, to steady himself. The cold surface beneath his fingers sent a jolt of ice through his arm. And in that moment, everything shifted. The hallway twisted. The mirrors cracked, the glass splintering into jagged shards. A whisper echoed in the dark. "Do you see?" The voice was familiar. Deep. Haunting. He turned, his pulse quickening. The man in the black coat stood at the end of the hallway. His eyes, those empty, hollow voids, were fixed on him. You thought you could escape. The voice boomed now, shaking the walls. You are the reflection, too. You've always been. The man took a step forward, and with each step, the mirrors cracked further. The reflections screamed, their mouths opening wide in silent agony, but no sound came. The man's grin spread. You are here because you are part of this. Always have been. He took another step, the air growing colder still. The floor began to tremble underfoot. You don't understand. This is your choice. Your path. The ground beneath him cracked. The reflections in the mirrors began to bleed, the glass shattering, splintering into 1,000 pieces. And then, just as suddenly, everything went still. The man in the black coat was gone. The hallway was silent once more. But the walls were still closing in. Faster now. He could feel the pressure. His chest was tight, the air thin. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one harder than the last. And then, just as the walls were nearly touching him, the hallway opened up into a vast, empty space. The mirrors were gone. The man was gone. But the oppressive weight of everything, the questions, the terror, the unknown, hung in the air. He stood in the middle of the void, the ground beneath him solid but invisible. A sudden realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This was never about escape. It was about facing the truth. The truth of what he had done. What he had become. His own reflection. He had always been part of it. All of it. He wasn't running from the man. He wasn't running from the reflections. He was running from himself. From what he had chosen. And as the void around him pulsed with an unnatural light, the truth became clear. There was nowhere to hide. Nowhere to run. This was the end. Not just for him, but for everything. And no matter how hard he tried, the walls would always close in. Because the only thing left in the end was him. The void was crushing. It wrapped around him like an iron grip, tighter and tighter, with each breath he took. His chest burned, and his mind felt like it was unraveling. The endless emptiness, the oppressive weight of it all, it suffocated him. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The light in the void flickered again, casting strange, long shadows across the ground beneath him. The ground, it wasn't solid anymore. It was shifting. The edges of the space warped and rippled like water disturbed by a stone. He stumbled forward, his legs unsteady, his vision a blur of fading light and shadow. But then, a movement, something in the distance. A figure. The same black-coated silhouette. The man. But this time, the figure was not just standing there. It was moving toward him. Slow, deliberate steps, each one echoing in the silence. With every footfall, the space seemed to grow smaller. Closer. His heart hammered in his chest. His breath quickened, shallow. He wanted to run. He needed to run. But his legs refused to obey. His body felt heavy. Paralyzed. And still, the man moved closer. The shadows around him shifted, stretching out like fingers, reaching toward him. The figure's face remained obscured, just a dark outline, but he could feel the eyes. Those void-like eyes. Staring straight through him. As if they already knew everything. The distance between them closed, until he could see the outlines of the man's features more clearly. The man's face was no longer twisted or deformed. It was almost normal. Almost. His eyes were empty, hollow sockets, just like before. But they weren't just empty. There was something inside them now. Something moving. A flicker of something. Do you understand now? The man's voice echoed in the vastness. The words cut through the silence like a knife. They lingered in his mind. You are the reflection. You've always been. The cold chill of the words wrapped around him, digging deep into his bones. The man reached out, his hands stretched toward him. He wanted to back away, but he couldn't move. His legs were frozen. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the man's hand, so unnervingly close. But before the hand could touch him, the space around him warped again. The ground beneath him cracked. The light flickered. Everything shifted. He was falling. It wasn't a fall like anything he had ever experienced before. It was endless. Like the very fabric of the world was being ripped apart around him. His body was weightless, his stomach churning. He looked down, but there was nothing to see. Just endless, swirling blackness. The light had vanished. All that remained was the sound of his own heartbeat, pulsing in his ears. Then the voices. Hundreds of them. Thousands. They whispered his name. Soft, insistent. Wake up. Wake up. Wake up. The voices grew louder, faster. The blackness stretched, bending and folding, until he could no longer tell if he was still falling, or if the ground had simply disappeared beneath him. But then, suddenly, the world snapped back into place. The fall stopped. He was standing again. No longer in the endless void. But where was he? The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic. He was inside a room. A small room. The walls were cracked. The floor was stained. But there were no mirrors. No reflections. He turned in a slow circle, trying to make sense of the room. It was familiar. Too familiar. The walls were peeling. The air smelled stale, like something had been rotting for years. There was a door in front of him. A simple, wooden door. It wasn't open, but it didn't have a lock either. He moved toward it, his legs still shaky. He reached for the handle, his fingers trembling. The door creaked open. And he stepped out. The hallway was narrow. Dimly lit. Shadows stretched along the walls. A single bulb overhead flickered, casting eerie, flickering shadows across the floor. He had been here before. He knew this place. His heart skipped a beat. The whispers returned, louder now. Wake up. And then, he heard it. The faintest sound of footsteps. The shuffle of shoes on linoleum. He turned quickly. Someone was coming. He didn't know who. But he knew. He couldn't stay. He turned, running down the hallway, the shadows chasing him. The walls seemed to close in, the floor beneath him buckling. His breath was ragged, his chest burning. The footsteps grew louder. Closer. He could hear them now. Quick. Fast. Unrelenting. And then, he heard the door behind him open. A figure stepped into the hallway, tall and imposing. He turned, his heart racing. But when he saw who it was, his blood ran cold. The man in the black coat. Standing in the doorway. Watching him. And then he spoke, the voice cutting through the tension. Did you really think you could escape? The question hung in the air. And all he could do was stare. Because in that moment, he knew the answer. There was no escaping. Not from himself. Not from the truth. Not from what he had become. The hallway stretched out before him. But it didn't matter. There was nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. He was trapped. In the reflection. Forever. The air grew heavy. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, pressing in closer. He stood frozen, staring at the man in the black coat. The figure was calm, unmoving. His hollow eyes locked onto him with a suffocating intensity. You thought you could outrun it? The man's voice came again, softer this time. Almost pitying. He couldn't speak. His throat was tight, dry. He wanted to move, to run, but his legs refused to obey. The floor beneath him felt like it was made of lead, grounding him in place. The footsteps from earlier had stopped. The world was too quiet now. Too still. Do you know what this is? The man asked. His voice reverberated through the hallway, a chilling echo. He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. The man in the black coat stepped forward, his boots scraping against the floor, the sound like a distant drumbeat. You were never meant to escape, the man said, his voice low, deliberate. This isn't a punishment. This is your reality. The words hit him like a physical blow. Reality. What had he been running from, really? The twisted mirrors, the endless hallways, the crushing darkness. It wasn't just some experiment. It was his mind. His guilt. His choices. His reflection. The truth was colder than he could ever have imagined. The man's figure loomed closer now, his presence like a shadow that swallowed the entire hallway. The walls felt even tighter, the floor slick with something unknown, like oil. He could feel the weight of the man's stare pressing against him, heavy as stone. All of this, the man gestured to the hallway, the cracked walls, the flickering light, was never about escaping. It was about confronting who you are. His chest tightened, the words reverberating in his skull. Who I am. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. He had been running, hiding. From his actions. From his past. From the things he had done. The things he had become. But it was all still here. The reflection wasn't just in the mirrors. It was in every hallway. Every corner. Every shadow. And the man wasn't just some twisted figure. He was him. The reflection of everything he had buried. He felt the cold hand of realization wrap around his throat. The reflection wasn't just his enemy, it was his mirror. His truth. His punishment. The man stopped just a few feet away. The air between them was thick with tension. The silence suffocating. I was you, the man whispered, barely audible. You've always known that. His words sank deep, like a hook dragging him into the depths of the ocean. The floor beneath him seemed to shift again. The hallways stretched endlessly in both directions. And then, the man in the black coat smiled. A slow, unsettling smile. But now you're ready. Ready to face the reflection. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to see what was staring back at him. But he couldn't stop himself. He glanced to the side. The mirror was there, just like before. But this time, it wasn't just a reflection. It was him. Standing there, staring back. But it wasn't the man in the black coat. It was him. His own eyes, his own face, staring out of the glass, hollow and empty. The reflection's lips curled into a twisted grin. And in that moment, he understood. He had never been running from the man. He had never been running from the hallway, the mirrors, or the dark spaces. He had been running from himself. The man in the black coat wasn't just a figure of his nightmares. He was the version of himself that he had refused to confront. The monster he had created. The truth he had hidden. The crimes he had committed. And now, in the hollow silence of the hallway, with the mirror watching him, he had nowhere left to run. His reflection stepped forward, its hand reaching out toward the glass. The surface shimmered for a moment, distorting, rippling. And as his own hand reached out, trembling, to touch the mirror, the reflection moved. It was no longer a mirror. It was real. It was alive. The world around him tilted. The ground cracked beneath his feet. The walls twisted. The space warped. The reflection stepped out of the glass, breaking through the barrier. He stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. Nowhere to escape. He was face to face with it now. With himself. And in that final moment, he realized. There was no escape from the reflection. Not now. Not ever. The truth had come for him. And this was where it would end. But not with a fight. Not with a scream. Just with the cold, hard silence of acceptance. As his own reflection reached out and touched his face, the darkness rushed in once more. And everything, was consumed. The hallway, the mirrors, the man, the truth. Gone. All that remained was the quiet. And the reflection. Endlessly staring. The silence was deafening. A heavy, thick fog that seemed to hang in the air, suffocating every inch of the space. His breath was shallow, ragged, caught in his chest as if his lungs had forgotten how to breathe. The reflection, his reflection, still stood before him. The mirrored version of himself, now completely separate from the glass. It wasn't just staring at him anymore. It was him. Or rather, it was something worse. The smile on his reflection's face grew wider, more sinister. His own eyes, his own soul, now twisted, deranged. The laughter came next. A low, guttural laugh that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It wasn't the sound of a person laughing. It was the sound of something broken, something fractured. Something that had never been whole. The reflection's grin stretched, its teeth sharp and unnatural. Asterisk, do you finally see? Asterisk. The reflection spoke, but it wasn't his voice. It was distorted, low, a twisted echo of his own. The words hung in the air, like smoke from a long-forgotten fire. Asterisk, you've been running so long, from this. From me, asterisk. The reflection's hand reached toward him, long fingers curling, inching closer. His own hand trembled. Every muscle in his body screamed to move, to escape, but his feet were nailed to the floor. He couldn't look away. The walls around him seemed to fold in on themselves. The hallway, the mirrors, the figure in the black coat, all of it started to fade, blurring, distorting. But the reflection remained. It was him. Every single decision. Every mistake. Every crime. Everything he had tried to hide from himself. The reflection knew. It was him. The truth he had buried deep in the recesses of his mind. The lies he told himself every day. The things he had done that he couldn't undo. The things he couldn't forgive. It wasn't just about the murder videos. It wasn't about the escape, the running. It was about the choices. The choices that led him here. The reflection smiled again, but this time it wasn't sinister. It was something else. Something worse. It was understanding. A knowing. You can't run anymore, it whispered, but there was no triumph in its voice. Only a cold acceptance. The floor beneath his feet began to crack. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in on him from all sides. The reflection's lips curled into that grotesque, unnatural smile. It was him now. And he had become it. The darkness began to consume him, filling every corner of his mind. Every shred of his identity. He was falling again. But this time, there was no light. No escape. His chest tightened, suffocating. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His mouth was dry, his body trembling. The reflection was inside him now. Inside his mind. He had always been running from the truth. But there was no escape from it anymore. And as the darkness swallowed him whole, the final, haunting truth echoed in his mind. There was no one left to run from. There was only him. And he had always known the reflection was his fate. The endless hallway disappeared, the mirrors shattered into nothingness. The man in the black coat was gone. And the last thing he felt, the last thing he saw, was the reflection's eyes. His own eyes. Staring back at him. A cold, hollow void. And then, nothing. The darkness was suffocating. Thick, dense, pressing in on him from all sides. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. Every inch of him felt crushed, trapped. His mind raced, thoughts tangled, desperate to escape. But there was no way out. No way to outrun what was happening. He was alone. The reflection, his reflection, still lingered in his mind. In his thoughts. Those hollow eyes. That twisted grin? It had never been the reflection in the glass that had terrified him. No. It was always the one he couldn't see. The one that lived inside him. The one he had ignored. Pushed away. Denied. And now, it was all-consuming. The sound of his heartbeat echoed in his ears, each thud louder than the last. His chest felt tight, as if the air itself had thickened, becoming solid. He had failed. There was no escape. There was no running anymore. He had always known the truth. Hadn't he? The things he'd done. The choices he'd made. The secrets he'd buried deep inside, pretending they didn't exist. But now, in this suffocating blackness, they were all there. All of them. And he had to face them. The man in the black coat. The murder videos. The lies. The guilt. The faces of the people he'd hurt. All of it was crashing in on him. Each memory, each face, each scream, it all piled on top of him. He tried to shut it out, but it was like trying to block out the air itself. The reflection, it wasn't just in his mind. It had always been part of him. A part he couldn't run from. And now that part was everything. The floor beneath him cracked, splitting apart like a broken mirror, pieces scattering into the void. He felt like he was falling, but there was no end. No bottom. Just endless, empty space. He had been running for so long, but there was nowhere left to go. No walls to hide behind. No escape. It was over. In the end, all that remained was him. And his reflection. And the terrible, inevitable truth. This was who he had always been. There was no turning back now. The darkness closed in. And the reflection smiled. The darkness was overwhelming, but now, it no longer felt suffocating. The weight of it, the pressure in his chest, began to dissipate slowly, quietly. As though the very act of acceptance had softened the blow. He stood in the vast, empty space, his body trembling, but not from fear. No. It was a different kind of trembling. One born of clarity. The reflection, that twisted version of himself that had haunted him through every shadow, every mirror, every hallway, had no power here. Not anymore. The memories, the guilt, the lies, the blood, had woven themselves into his very being, yes. But they had also lost their grip. Because in that moment, he understood. Understanding wasn't freedom, no. But it was the first step. The hallway around him, the darkened space, began to flicker and fade. The walls cracked, but not in anger, not in rage, just in the quiet unraveling of a long-held illusion. He had tried so hard to run. To hide. To escape the truth. But the truth had never been the monster. The monster had been his refusal to face it. The reflections, the grotesque, twisted versions of him, no longer loomed in the corners of his vision. They were gone. There was only the stillness now. And the faintest whisper of the wind. He looked up, and for the first time, he wasn't afraid to meet his own eyes. The silence stretched on. The empty space seemed to hold its breath. But he was no longer lost in it. There was a door. Not an imposing, dark doorway. No, this one was simple. Ordinary even. A wooden door, with a small crack of light peeking through. He walked toward it, his footsteps steady, the echoes soft against the quiet. He reached for the handle. And for the first time, his hand didn't tremble. The door opened slowly. And beyond it, there was light. Not blinding. Not harsh. But warm. Gentle. He stepped through, leaving the darkness behind. There was no final chase. No last reflection to face. Just a soft, steady breath of peace. And as the door quietly closed behind him, the weight of the world seemed to lift. Not because it was gone, but because he had finally learned to live with it. And that, in itself, was enough.